I've reviewed about 200 different monitors and this one has left me scratching my head. It's called the Lenovo Legion Y25-30, a Full HD 280Hz IPS monitor, which can be found for roughly £300 in the UK, at least of course at the time of filming. It follows on from the Y25-25 that I previously reviewed in early 2021 that had a similar panel apart from the fact that it was running at 240Hz instead of 280Hz. Now in this review we'll be comparing it to its rivals, including its siblings, and to see if it's actually worth its price tag. Now to kick off this video I do want to talk about its display inputs. It's got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 and two HDMI 2.0 ports. The former will give you Full HD at 280Hz with 10-bit support, while the latter will limit you to 240Hz at 1080p, so something worth considering if you're using this monitor while connected over to, let's say, a laptop, and given the fact that it has HDMI 2.0, it is indeed limited. Now furthermore, if you were to connect over HDMI, you will see that the factory overclock is actually grayed out, and just further re-emphasizes the points that if you do want to benefit from the full refresh rate and resolution of said monitor, you'll be having to connect over DisplayPort. On that note, I should share my experiences of actually running or trying to run at 280Hz. See, while connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080, sometimes it would just refuse to run at 280Hz. Not my computer setup, but rather the monitor. Enabling the overclock on the OSD would suddenly just refresh it back to 240Hz, as if something was just blocking it. I ended up switching off the monitor, resetting it multiple times, and finally I had 280Hz working without any hitches. And since then I've been able to utilize 280Hz. So with all of that in mind, I wanted to put it through its paces, so I tested its input lag. Now here you can see two massively different figures. 6.8 milliseconds at 280Hz and 2.4 milliseconds at 240Hz. Indeed, over here 2.4 milliseconds is seriously impressive for a Full HD 240Hz panel, while 6.8 milliseconds is one of the slowest that I've ever tested to date. Now you might be wondering, why is there such discrepancy between the two? And here I did run the test a multitude of times just to ensure there was no problem on my end. I even reset the monitor, as I did mention before, and even changed cables and changed in terms of the ports on my graphics card, which is the RTX 3080. Yet again, no issues in terms of my end, and unfortunately the figures were coming out as I did share. So then I had a little light bulb moment. Why don't I test for frame skipping? This is a phenomenon that I hadn't experienced for over 5 years of testing, and unfortunately this was present on the Lenovo Legion Y25-30. Indeed, via the Blurbusters test, you can see that at 280Hz there's some clear frame skipping that is occurring. I could even notice it with my own eyes, didn't even need my camera to actually take the photo. Here you can see that at 240Hz there is none such issue, further emphasizing the point that there's a massive difference between 240Hz and 280Hz. Ultimately here, Lenovo should rethink their monitor, be it in terms of a firmware update or indeed potentially recalling the monitor altogether in order to address the frame skipping issue that occurs at 280Hz. Now to further re-emphasize the point, I used another tool by the guys at Blurbusters, and here indeed is the UFO ghosting test. Now here you can see that at 280Hz the lines don't align, and indeed this is not a valid result and something that shouldn't be catered for. Now this was at 280Hz with MPRT, and MPRT is usually very easy to take an image of. And here you can see how it should actually look like, and this is because this is the result at 240Hz. So yes, at 280Hz I was struggling to take a photo. No matter which mode I was running, even on the easiest mode, in other words to capture an image, I still couldn't get a valid result, which just made me think that 280Hz was not working because fundamentally there was some frame skipping issues, and therefore meant that it was actually unusable and unplayable at its maximum refresh rate. So with that in mind, I actually had all valid results for my 240Hz tests, and here you can see how it performs with the different overdrive modes. The higher the overdrive level, the more inverse ghosting you might attain, but at the flip side you'll get a faster response time. And indeed over here you can see that in level 4 mode there's a little bit more of inverse ghosting that's notable over level 3 mode. Now as for MPRT mode, which gives you lower motion blur and indeed clears up that UFO, you will also notice a little bit of inverse ghosting. And that is because when you are running on MPRT mode, it automatically dials it to the overdrive level 4. No matter what overdrive mode you had selected in the OSD, it will effectively overwrite it. Now for me to obtain some objective data when it comes to a monitor's response time, I use the OSRTT tool. And here on its overdrive off mode, I got an average initial time, which translates to average D to G, at 6.22 milliseconds. You'll see this figure listed at the bottom left hand side of your screen. So going on to level 1, it goes down to 5.53 milliseconds. Level 2, it goes down even further to 4.76 milliseconds. Level 3, it goes down even lower to 3.92 milliseconds. Now I want you to also shift your attention to the RGB overshoot, which you can see towards the middle of your screen, because now as we transition to the level 4 mode, you can see that there's a lot more red on your screen. All while saying that, the average initial time drops down to a stonkingly low 2.91 milliseconds. Subjectively, what I will say over here is that while I was playing more graphically intense games, I found myself dialing it down to the level 3 mode. While playing a more potato looking game such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive, I found that level 4 mode didn't incur too much inverse ghosting to throw off my shots, and yet here I knew that the average initial time was the lowest possible, and thus is the mode that I actually chose when it came to serious hardcore gaming. Now all of these tests that I've shared so far were at 240Hz, but here I also did the test at 280Hz, just to see how it compared. In an overdrive off mode, it sits at 5.86 milliseconds, level 1 5.25 milliseconds, level 2 4.54 milliseconds, then level 3 3.81 milliseconds, and then level 4 at 2.81 milliseconds. Effectively here, the differences between 280Hz and 240Hz were actually pretty similar as far as the average initial time goes. Now you might have noticed that I omitted an MPRT figure, and indeed due to my testing limitations I can't get one, but I will say subjectively that it's pretty much on par with what you should be able to expect with the level 4 mode, both in terms of the RGB overshoot or indeed the inverse ghosting, and also the average initial time, in other words how quickly the monitor is responding. Frankly here, in terms of MPRT mode and playing a hardcore competitive game such as CSGO, I was left really impressed. Although the only thing worth bearing in mind over here is that MPRT mode will lock the overall brightness that one can attain, and furthermore can't be used simultaneously with HDR nor AMD FreeSync or indeed NVIDIA G-Sync. Now aside from all of this, I think it's very important to share my own subjective opinion. As someone who shoved over 2,500 hours on competitive Counter-Strike and also has reviewed 200 different panels, I can safely say this is one of the most impressive Full HD 240Hz monitors. Indeed, while running at its lowered refresh rate of 240Hz, the input lag and response time were up there with some of the very best, meaning that if you're a hardcore competitive gamer, such as playing CSGO or say Valorant, I think you'll find that this monitor is very well adept. Now I will say that the differences between 240Hz and 280Hz on other monitors which don't suffer from any sort of frame skipping or input lag problems, it's very minimal. Of course you're getting an increased amount of refresh rate at 280Hz, but for you to actually notice the difference between 240Hz and 280Hz, well, I will be very hard pressed if anyone can actually safely say that they can notice a positive impact on their KD, or indeed in terms of hitting their shots or seeing enemies a little bit faster at 280Hz as opposed to 240Hz. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that even at 240Hz, this monitor is really impressive, and I wouldn't really be looking past the monitor's performance just because it can't hit its 280Hz claimed refresh rate. Now past hardcore competitive gaming, I should talk about more casual gaming, and by this I mean in terms of enabling AMD FreeSync or indeed NVIDIA G-Sync. Now for me, on terms of the latter system, I have got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort, I had no problems outputting the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, and therefore didn't incur any sort of black screen or flickering issues. Better still, due to this monitor also supporting HDR, I was able to play Destiny 2 at Full HD at 240Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync running and HDR, all of which worked in tandem and yet again had no sort of problems whatsoever. Indeed, the tear-free gaming experience is pretty good, although bearing in mind that here it does not have a native G-Sync module and therefore doesn't benefit from the full VRR range, and indeed over here you should be expecting a FreeSync or indeed NVIDIA G-Sync range of 48Hz up to 280Hz, or of course in my case 240Hz. So moving swiftly on, we get onto its HDR experience, and here I must say I was actually left pretty impressed, not due to its overall peak brightness which sat at around 416 nits and therefore can't compete with monitors that hit over 600 nits, although these are also 1440p monitors and far more expensive, but nonetheless here in comparison to its near rivals, in other words Full HD high refresh rate monitors, it actually did a far better job, and that's because the overall software implementation implementation by the manufacturer was done really well, whereby the data that was shoved through via HDR versus SDR was processed really well, and therefore meant the tonality and the image looked really good, at least from my own subjective opinion. Here I feel that a lot of people will actually appreciate its HDR signal, be it if you're on a PC or indeed a console. On that note, if you are a PC gamer but also own a console, this monitor will run Full HD at 120Hz over HDMI. You do not need HDMI 2.1 in order to output said resolution or refresh rates. Now with the gaming section out of the way, we get onto image quality, and here the monitor runs a 24.5-inch IPS panel that runs up to 280Hz at Full HD. Of course, due to my limitations and problematic experience at 280Hz, I ran it at 240Hz. Now I would like to point out that something that was a little bit odd again was through the monitor's OSD's sRGB mode. Indeed, it has a dedicated emulation mode that you can enable. Now while doing it, it will actually lock you out of the brightness controls, but that's not to mean that the actual brightness is actually locked. See here, if you were to adjust it outside of the sRGB mode, then enable the sRGB emulation mode, it will lock it to whatever the brightness was at, which just does seem a little bit counterintuitive. Either have the sRGB emulation mode lock the brightness altogether at a certain brightness level, or have it that you can just adjust the brightness level when it's in sRGB mode, which would definitely be more preferable. Ultimately over here, if you're going to be editing in the sRGB color space, you might want to adjust the brightness before you actually enable sRGB mode. Hopefully Lenovo can actually address this via future firmware updates, because I just felt it was quite counterintuitive. Now nonetheless, in its sRGB emulation mode, and indeed via my calibrators, I noted a gamut coverage of 99.2% and a gamut volume of 105.2%, of course in said mode. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard. The overall average delta E and the maximum delta E sit at 1.11 and 1.79, which is seriously impressive for a high refresh rate gaming monitor. Its tested contrast ratio, however, was a little bit subpar at 805:1, but its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target was pretty bang on at 6367 Kelvin. As for the gamma, it sat pretty close to the 2.2 standard. Now if you want your colors to pop a little bit more and you're a gamer and you don't care about image editing or video grading, then you might want to go on terms of one of the other presets and indeed disable sRGB emulation mode. Here you can see that the gamma coverage and gamma volumes have been positively impacted in sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3, so much so that the graph below actually refers to the wider color gamut DCI-P3 modes. Equally, the average delta E and maximum delta E are put in comparison to the DCI-P3 levels rather than the sRGB. Now as for the tested contrast ratio, it doesn't change, while the measured white point is even more impressive at 6481 Kelvin at 100%. Yet again, in terms of its gamma coverage, it's pretty close to the 2.2 standard. Now moving on, we get onto the monitor's brightness, and here in HDR I recorded 416 nits. In SDR it's still pretty high at 346 nits, and it gets down to 67 nits, which I actually wish it got a little bit lower. Nonetheless, it should suffice in terms of the range it provides and can be used in either a bright sunlit room or indeed a pitch black room. As for the NPRT brightness, it sat at a locked 174 nits, which I actually found pretty playable, at least in a darker room. Now on the subject of its peak luminance, we get on to brightness uniformity, and here on my tested panel, and of course bearing in mind it is somewhat panel lottery, it actually did well across the board, but you can see it fainting a little bit in terms of the bottom right hand corner. And indeed via my backlight bleed test, I did notice a little bit of bleed coming in terms of the right corner. It was perfectly playable for me in darker games, but of course if it's something that you're going to be sensitive to, you might want to look at a VA panel altogether. Now with all of that out of the way, I should just mention the monitor's design, and here it's got a three-side borderless finish with a relatively thin bezel at the bottom, which also has a Legion finish, which actually does look pretty premium. Equally towards the rear of the monitor, it looks pretty snazzy and does stand out in comparison to the competitors. Equally, its stand has got this triangular look and has got this sort of mesh finish to it, all of which just adds to the overall aesthetics. Now the stand itself is also very practical. It provides height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, therefore giving you good ergonomics. It's also pretty sturdy. Of course, if you don't want to use the built-in stand, you can replace it if you so wish, or of course place it on a monitor arm. Now as for the buttons, which are found at the bottom right and behind the monitor, they allow you to access the monitor's comprehensive OSD. Indeed, over here allows you to tinker around with some of the settings, although do bear in mind some of the complaints that I've mentioned throughout this review. namely for example in terms of its sRGB modes. Now further expanding on this, you do also have software, whereby there's the Lenovo Display Control Center. It provides the same level of customization as the hardware-based OSD, although there is the overclock mode that is missing for some reason via the software, but aside from this it allows a further degree of customization and therefore makes it quite intuitive to use if you do not want to be relying on the hardware-based OSD. So with all of that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Lenovo Legion Y25-30, and if we take 280Hz out the equation, its 240Hz performance is seriously impressive, arguably even class leading. See here the input lag, the response time, the refresh rate, the G-Sync capabilities, and of course AMD FreeSync, HDR, and whereby it's processed pretty well in comparison to its competitors. Then in terms of its color performance, and even throw in its overall design aesthetics, the monitor's OSD and software-based OSD, it actually ticks a lot of boxes. The problem, however, is that looking at a Full HD 240Hz monitor, it's actually pretty expensive, at around £300 at least at the time of filming and in the UK. As such, I would actually recommend looking at some of the alternatives. They'll be down in the description below, and the ones I would actively recommend would be the Asus and the AOC. Now I'd be curious to know which monitor you would pick and what you make of this monitor, specifically if you own it. Now, if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review and want to see more, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.